Well, welcome everybody to our discussion today about Scope 2 accounting and the greenhouse gas protocol. We're really delighted to have everyone here. I know you're not able to necessarily see how many folks are joining us today, but we are expecting almost 700 people logging in to our call today. So it's clearly a topic on lots of people's minds. And we are really, really lucky to have the two Michaels, who are both true experts in this very wonky technical world of greenhouse gas accounting, broadly, but specific to today's conversation will be focused primarily on greenhouse gas accounting and Scope 2, which hopefully if you've logged into this discussion, you know already means the greenhouse gas accounting associated with largely the purchased electricity for most organizations and people. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and give a brief overview of who the two Michaels are. And then they can chime in and tell us a little bit more about themselves. Just to give you context on me, I'm Miranda Ballentine. I come by the energy customer world, the demand side of the equation, pretty honestly. I spent about 7 or 8 years at Walmart back in the early days of corporates getting in the game of decarbonizing power. And there I was in charge of Walmart's global renewable energy and sustainable facilities work. So I was charged with trying to figure out how the Fortune #1 company at the time would achieve this audacious goal set in 2005 to be supplied by 100% renewable energy, amongst some other things. I also led energy strategy as the chief energy officer, which was part of my role when I was the assistant secretary of the Air Force. And the United States Air Force is the largest energy customer in the US government, which is the largest energy customer in the United States and a very large energy customer in the world. And then I think probably most of you know me best as the founding CEO of the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance. So I've worn a lot of hats over the years, but really mostly on the demand side of the equation. And I am going to be moderating today a discussion between Michael Gillenwater and Michael Leggett. Michael Gillenwater is a true expert in the field, and I feel like I should start by reminding everyone that Michael Gillenwater is a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize with other colleagues for his efforts on over many years on the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So we really are with somebody who has been passionate, thoughtful, thorough, technical, in the weeds. He has done greenhouse gas accounting with the EPA. He has led some of the work with the greenhouse gas protocol in the past. He sits on the technical committee of the Science-Based Target Initiative. And he, as I mentioned, was a long-term contributor to the IPCC reports, which are, of course, what we're all really focused on. He's a professor, lecturer, thought leader, prolific writer, and we're really fortunate to have his thinking with us today. Partnering with Michael Gillenwater is Michael Leggett, who has also a very storied career. He spent 10 years at Google, 3 years at Meta, and he has been really a leader in thinking about how do we leverage software and data to accelerate markets, both for carbon reductions and carbon offsets, as well as now in his current role as co-founder of Evergreen, really looking to accelerate the voluntary clean energy markets. Together, they co-wrote a piece just a couple of weeks ago, really looking at the limitations and challenges with hourly matching of Scope 2 emissions. And so that's what we're going to dive into today. Before I turn it over to my wonderful panelists, discussants this morning, I thought I would remind us all of where we came from. So if you look back 10 years to about 2014, that's when the Clean Energy Buyers Alliance community was first starting to thinking about working together. But even further back to 2008 or 9, which was when the first voluntary utility scale power purchase agreements for wind projects were done. And you think about those early days, just 10 or 12 years ago, there were only two or three, maybe four companies that had successfully used their demand side power to develop new clean energy projects. The vast majority of companies then, as now, didn't buy power on long-term contracts. They were buying power on monthly utility bill payments. Most companies still just pay monthly utility bill payments. Um, and fast forward to today, just 10, 12 years later, this community of voluntary clean energy buyers has really blossomed. We have, according to SEBA, over 200 companies that are buying large-scale renewable energy today. That is not including companies that are buying standalone unbundled RECs or renewable energy certificates. Globally, these voluntary markets have contracted for 200 gigawatts of renewables. Here in the US, it's over 100 gigawatts. Again, not counting unbundled standalone RECs, just looking at power purchase agreements, virtual power purchase agreements, green tariffs, tax equity deals, on-site projects. And the developers themselves and their trade associations, ACOR and others, are very clear that these long-term power purchase agreements, these long-term guarantees of revenue, are really critical for these projects being developed. So the market is important and has been important. And when we look at where we need to go from here, the International Energy Agency in 2023 told us that we need to be globally deploying 1,200 gigawatts every single year of new renewable energy capacity. 1,200 gigawatts every single year of new renewable energy capacity. So with that, what we're really going to talk about today is how do we make that happen? How do we bring that to fruition? And how do rules and reward systems that underpin these markets influence that? And in particular, we're going to focus even more narrow to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 rewrite process. So with that, why don't we get started? We do have a couple of slides, but we're going to try to keep this as conversational as we can between the two Michaels. And we're going to try to move through materials pretty quick so that we can take questions through the Q&A on the chat. So with that, Tara, or whoever's running the slides, maybe you can put the first slide up and we'll get started.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that wonderful intro, and make sure everyone can see my slides. Hopefully you can see them right now. What you should see on the screen is we need to move to renewables faster. And if you can't see that, please say so in the chat. So I think wonderful intro, and I don't measure up to the Nobel laureate Michael Gillenwater, but I'm really excited to be here with all of you today. I think, looking at why is this rewrite happening? Why is there pressure? And I think looking at the criticisms of the current guidelines and of current corporate action, I would generally categorize this into three buckets. I think one of the buckets is that, RECs or EACs or GOs, that they don't represent clean energy that could have been used. There's often these stories of, you're buying RECs off of solar projects and you're using power in the middle of the night. And so there's questions around kind of the inventory accounting and usage claims. I think the second is the emissions accounting is not as accurate as it could be, as the tons of CO2 emitted from consumption of electricity or the generation of electricity to enable that consumption can be quite different from the tons of CO2 avoided by building a new project from that kind of clean megawatt hour within current market boundaries. And then the third is that we're generally just not making as much progress decarbonizing our world as reports would suggest. That assuming that we're avoiding double counting, this is more often a criticism of, causation or additionality. The question of, and I think there is a question of, should buying a REC enable projects to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise? I think some of these criticisms may not be appropriate given the role of Greenhouse Gas Protocol, and the fact that scope 2 is inventory accounting. So I think it's fair to question the questions. But I think in general, we are all on the same team and that we want to, as rapidly as possible, decarbonize our world.
And
Yeah,
Leggett, I forgot that all of our colleague Holly Ladd recently challenged us to begin every conversation by asking, what is our decarbonization theory of change? So I appreciate you diving in, and would you back up and
yeah,
share what is your theory of change for decarbonizing the power system? And then we're going to switch over to Michael Gillenwater, um, and Michael Gillenwater, you can also start with what is your electricity decarbonization theory of change? And then I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more also around why now? Why is the greenhouse gas protocol revising the scope 2 protocol and rethinking it now?
fantastic. I'll quickly say that, my theory of change is really that companies can help decarbonizing or clean energy projects obtain financing through long-term agreements. And I think or upfront investments. And I think companies generally do that to meet sustainability goals and targets. So the rules that govern what counts matter a lot to that participation.
Okay, I'll jump in, and I share that same theory of change that Michael Leggett just elaborated. But I think in practice we have like multiple theories of change, right? Because we have multiple tools. One tool relates to the context of voluntary climate action, which I was going to say Leggett, so we don't get ourselves tripped up on each other. Mentioned is largely driven through recognition mechanisms, recognition for kind of exceptional corporate climate performance. But obviously, there's lots of other tools. There's policy tools. There's other regulatory tools. But here we're obviously just talking about this voluntary recognition context, in which case it is the largely this de-risking effect for renewable energy and other related energy project finance in the power sector.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of the next question that Miranda posited, and we can advance the slide. In terms of the current moment we're in, the question of why are we updating now? The critic in me would have said why didn't we update 10 years ago? But unless you're living under a rock, and I'm not sure why you would have subscribed to this webinar, you're probably aware that the GHG standards and protocols and programs across a whole range of initiatives are being updated right now. Obviously, the GHG protocol corporate standard is in the middle of an update process. SBTI is updating its corporate net zero standard and a host of other sector-based standards. ISO is developing a new net zero standard. There's lots of things going on within the European Commission on different disclosure and regulatory things. California. There was obviously things going on within the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, not anymore, and lots of other venues where there's lots of moving parts going on. And so it's a heady time. It's a critical time to kind of figure this stuff out. It's an important time to look at the lessons of the past and try and hopefully fix some things that will work for the long term. I will note, as I've written before, unfortunately, we're doing some of this a little bit backwards, and that some of the kind of recognition program standards like SBTI are slightly ahead of the updating of the rules for the underlying GHG accounting, like the GHG protocol. In theory, you would want to update the basic accounting rules first, and then update the rules for the recognition based on that accounting. But we're doing it a little bit backwards, which is going to create a little bit of a problem. But we're all doing this in the context of Obviously, shifting political winds, especially in North America, are right now, unfortunately, in a bad direction, where renewables are, facing a little more headwinds than we thought they might have a couple of years ago. And so that just means these kinds of voluntary corporate actions might even play potentially a more important role, at least in the short term. So it's important to get this right. And lastly, hopefully it'll be obvious, or it is obvious. As Michael said, we're all on the same team in the big picture. We want to advance climate mitigation and climate action. There's lots of different tools to do that. And it's just a debate on like how to do that best, given the complexity of this situation, both in terms of how to establish voluntary recognition programs and within a dynamic government policy landscape.
So Gillenwater put out a lot of threads that we could pull there. I like the distinction between the rules systems and the recognition systems. And indeed, as someone who has been on the side of the buyer, the rules and recognition systems absolutely support or create the ecosystem within which these markets operate. And the numbers that I put out at the beginning, the 100 gigawatts of renewable energy projects that corporate off-takers have driven here in the United States, the vast majority of those have been power purchase agreements or virtual power purchase agreements. We do see a number of other mechanisms in there, some self-ownership, some utility green tariff programs or bilateral agreements, some tax equity investments, but most have been long-term power purchase agreements and virtual power purchase agreements. And most of those have been matched in terms of the annual volume of a customer's use has been matched annually with their procurement. And typically what companies do is they aggregate their own load across a geography, usually at the country level. And that aggregation of load has been really critical to get to the level of scale of offtake to be able to enter these long-term power purchase agreements. So Michael Gillenwater put out there rules and rewards recognitions. And what I'd love to hear from you is, what are we actually trying to measure in the rules system? Are we measuring megawatt hours consumed? Are we measuring the zero emission factor of the project that someone is buying through their power purchase agreement? Are we measuring actually avoided emissions that project helped to make not happen? Or are we measuring actually reduced emissions? Thinking to Gillenwater's previous role in the carbon development mechanism, are we actually measuring certified emission reductions? This starts to get very complicated if you're a company for whom energy is not your business. What are we actually measuring here? The megawatts hours I consume, the zero emission grid factor, the avoided emissions, the reduced emissions. Walk us through that a little bit with this kind of crazy graphic on the next slide.
Yeah, I think that, and this somewhat speaks to a challenge of what can we measure. So, and I think what should we measure? So, I mean, there's lots of different dimensions to that. And I think, so let's get into a little bit what is possible. Is it possible to trace the exact source of electricity? And I think there's a nuanced answer here. I think that knowing the single source, like once the electricity enters into the grid, it mixes. So physics is kind of our first, big challenge here to an accurate inventory of what did you use, if that's what you want to measure and kind of understand. So I think that there isn't really perfect tracing, but you can still, I don't think it's possible to quite perfectly exactly know the source of each watt hour. But I think there are ways to approximate what that mix might be. So we can have better idea or better, optics of kind of utilization. So there are ways to estimate the mix of generation serving a location, and whether that power, from a source is even deliverable. So is power from one point to another point is that, possible to deliver? Is it likely, within some constraints? And you could also layer on top of that kind of congestion. Okay, these 2 points are connected, but was power actually flowing, or was it getting stuck in between those 2 points? And there's ways of modeling that. So it's complicated as to like kind of what exactly is possible. But I think while we can't track the exact source of each watt hour, we can make things more accurate. And certainly we can create better optics. And I think if we assume that the emissions is the same within a region and on an hour, are more similar than on broader, kind of boundaries, it could indicate an improved accuracy of kind of emissions accounting underlying that. So I think it is, important for us to be honest about what is possible, but also to be honest about what, both what's hard and what is possible going both directions. As far as what should we be counting, I think that there is a simplicity to just counting megawatt hours and not getting into the exact tons of CO2, emitted or avoided. But I also think that that simplicity might make opaque kind of less accuracy in the actual emissions, which is really what we care about at the end of the day. We don't care about megawatt hours, we care about tons of CO2. That is, it's a greenhouse gas, it's not greenhouse megawatt hours. So these are kind of proxies for us trying to getting at what the emissions are and what the impact is and what progress is. And I think that that's understandable and admirable. But I also think at the end of the day, we care about tons of CO2 and other greenhouse gases.
Great. And we already have some questions coming into the Q&A. So I just want to tell the audience, please keep them coming in, and we're going to continue to go through the slides. We already have a question around outside of the United States. There are some markets where a physical PPA is not even a possibility. And of course, in some markets, even a virtual PPA is not a possibility, even in some markets in the United States, but certainly in some markets in Europe, and some markets in Asia, and some markets in Central and South America, across the African continent. So I think one question we can start planting, Michael and Michael, for yourselves is how might a limitation on geographic and hourly matching be implemented or be a challenge in markets where there are really no tools at play. So we will start to get to that. But Michael Leggett, when we all started this work 10, 15 years ago, there was very, very little renewable energy penetration whatsoever on really any grid other than those that were highly hydropower. So can you talk to us a little bit about the changing grid, and as the grid gets greener and greener, thanks to government regulations, does it become more important for individual companies to refocus their efforts sort of more inward on their own assets, as opposed to focusing their efforts outward onto the broader grid and decarbonizing the broader grid? Can you just speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, you talked about this kind of grid citizenship. So kind of focusing on your own load versus what's best for the grid. And I think there's also a question of focusing on, building more, capacity versus better integrating that capacity. And I think some of the criticism of today's standards is that it doesn't help us tackle kind of the variable nature of solar and wind. That, solar, the sun is, really powers both of those, and that sun actually creates wind. But I think that, the sun isn't always shining. The wind isn't always blowing. But what we want to get to is running on clean energy every hour of every day. So I think that's a fair criticism that the current standards aren't necessarily incentivizing that. I think that some grids have reached a high level of solar and wind. And so I think those mature grids, the integration does start to become almost more important than just building more capacity. You often hear about kind of the duck curve and trying to smooth out the duck curve, which is, kind of representing throughout a day that energy, will be, peak in the middle, but utilization is less. And so there's a non-matching between when is power wanted and when is power produced. So I think, especially in those regions, this integration challenge is a real challenge. I think that current guidelines, which allow annual matching, don't incentivize, addressing that in real ways. And I think there are, things we could do to improve that. I think that we could focus on how do we make clean grids 100% clean? And my question would be, should that be our focus? I think that a lot of the themes throughout this conversation are about, kind of one size doesn't fit all. And so a lot of the world is still running on less than 15% of solar and wind. And there's certainly plenty of states, even inside the United States, where it's less than 1%. So is it time to turn our attention to getting kind of from, 35 to 60% to 100%? Or are we still kind of at a place where, are there still regions where building the next megawatt of capacity does more to decarbonize our world than building a battery to shift existing generation to different hours? We need both. And increasingly, we need more of the later. But I think there's still a lot of the world that just needs another megawatt of capacity. So I don't know if there's a one size fits all here within this dimension.
Yeah, and I think this is a great slide to look at with the duck curve. Although folks can't see everyone who's on the line, we do have a number of the authors of a recent McKinsey study that actually looked at how do we ultimately, as a community, achieve a 24/7 grid, a decarbonized system level grid for everyone, everywhere, all the time. And it was a fantastic piece of work that really looked at if the biggest companies, those who are most sophisticated and able to do these clean energy deals, and mind you, that number is still very small. We have 200 companies doing deals. If those companies refocus only on their own assets becoming carbon free versus focusing on the full grid, how batteries, storage, and base load carbon free power is deployed looks very different than if those companies are focused on decarbonizing the grid for everyone, everywhere, all the time. So I would encourage everyone to go take a look at that. It's a really very, very interesting study that has similar charts to this, but show how batteries get deployed. Michael Gillenwater, we did have another question that came in, kind of hearkening back to, okay, this greenhouse gas protocol scope 2 hasn't been updated in 10 years. What are they really trying to get after with this next update? Maybe you could walk us through the sort of three pillars of integrity, impact, and feasibility. And in particular, looking at integrity of accounting, how are some of the proponents of hourly and geographic matching thinking about integrity of accounting?
Yeah, integrity is one of those words where it's open to the interpretation of the user, and who can be against integrity, but sort of integrity for what? And I think this gets at the one of the points that I've been writing about a lot for those that have gone through the painful work of wading through some of my essays in the past. There's a lot of confusion here about what is the purpose or the intended use of all this accounting, and clearly there's multiple different intended uses going on here, and the real challenge is we're not really being clear. We, meaning kind of this whole update process, oftentimes it's not being clear about what we're trying to do. We're trying to do several things at once with one protocol, oftentimes. With inventories, emission inventories, I mean, they're relatively simple. You draw a box by setting the boundaries around something, a company or a country. You list all the emission sources and sinks that fall within that box, and then you tally up the emissions and the removals, and that's it. You're done. That's what an inventory is. But hopefully it's obvious the problems with the limitations of inventories is it misses things that fall outside that box. Especially like if a company takes actions that affect sources or sinks outside that boundary, then it's not accounted for in inventory. But companies do that, and they want to get recognized for that. And so what happens is then we try and come up with kludges to try and morph or play with the boundaries or play with the rules so that those other things get captured. And what we end up with is really fuzzy accounting rules and fuzzy boundaries that lead to non-comparable inventories and kind of messy, kind of non-representative time series of estimates, so that we don't know really, whether or not a company is really getting better or worse. And then, and companies want to get recognized for actions that really make impact. They get frustrated with some of the rules, and then we end up with things like market-based accounting to try and fix some of these limitations. But what we really want here is some sort of mitigation impact reporting framework. And so we think we have this one tool called inventory. We want to do, account for mitigation impact. And so we try and force that into the inventory. And then, play with the rules to make that happen. I would argue that, what we really probably should be doing is setting up a separate reporting framework that does what we want it to do, which is mitigation impact reporting, and while still having the inventory do what the inventory does, is account for stuff within kind of a well-defined boundary. And both can live in a happy world. We don't have to, we can have more than one metric for recognizing good corporate climate performance than just the inventory. What's happening here is with market-based mechanisms is essentially we're trying to embed, a emissions trading system of sorts with certificates and other things. We're trying to embed that within the inventory accounting rules. And I would argue it's a bit dishonest because it's not, what's really going on here is not about the accuracy of GC inventory accounting. It's about environmental market design, emissions market design, and the efficacy of essentially a market policy mechanism in this context, in the context of a voluntary recognition, but still a policy mechanism, a trading mechanism, a market mechanism. And so we're having, a debate around the wrong questions. We're making arguments justified by inventory accuracy when we're really talking about how do we best design, market accounting rules, market-based accounting rules to achieve a policy objective. And so we're no longer really talking about policy neutral inventory accounting rules. And therefore we have this messy argument and debate that is justifying stuff with the wrong kind of principles and the wrong questions.
We have really great questions coming in, so I'm going to try to incorporate them as we go through these remaining slides. And for the audience members, the three of us have agreed that we're going to make sure to take all the questions and write up our best shot at answers and get them out to all of the participants, because we knew we would run out of time. So before we move off of this slide, Michael Gillenwater, we did have a question around, is all this focus on accuracy of accounting, particularly accuracy of accounting megawatt hours versus accuracy of accounting of emission factors, avoided emissions and reduced emissions, might that be shifting our focus as a community away from pillar number 2 on this slide around impact, which really is what drives companies to be doing clean energy procurement in a voluntary way to begin with, is really looking to drive impact.
I mean, yes. I mean, back to the same point. I mean, inventories can measure impact, but they measure impact within, from just the sources in that box, right? In that inventory accounting boundary. And companies do things that obviously affect sources in that box as well as sources outside of that box, and some things they do affect both at the same time. And that's why we need these multiple tools. If we try and combine everything into one thing we call an inventory that's quickly becomes not really anything that looks like an inventory anymore, then we end up with this kind of kludgy thing that doesn't really do anything well. And again, it all kind of devolves down to this I guess presumption we've developed over time is that we have this one thing called an inventory, and all of our recognition has to fall, it has to be accounted for in this one thing called a corporate inventory. When in practice, we can, we're smart enough people. Obviously, we're dealing with lots of complexity. We can have several different metrics that actually more clearly and transparently recognize companies for in different ways because they're doing different kinds of things that have different kinds of impacts.
So let's jump to what is slide 9, which is a little bit more on where exactly are we in the process of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 2 being updated. We have a couple of questions that have come in that pertain to this section. So we had, for example, and I want both of you to walk through kind of where things stand now, but also touch on a couple of these questions. So we had one person ask about, is there a push for utilities to be providing globally more granular data to off-takers, because many users actually have no idea about the intensity of the grid during their time. Grid emission factors are often a year or two out of date. The grid emission factors are also generalized. They're not time and location specific necessarily. They're pretty broad regions. So speak a little bit to the role of data, and then speak a little bit about just where we are in the process.
Sure, I'll try and do this quickly. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of great work going on in terms of better data. Obviously, that varies across jurisdictions in terms of the very nature of wholesale power market structures. Some are more amenable to more advanced data systems than others, for a whole host of reasons around market regulation and vertical integration or lack thereof. But yeah, I think we need to clarify. So there's a lot of work going on in terms of how to actually get better kind of actual physical data on power generation, temporally resolved, and which units are dispatching when, and having that more real-time data, and more geographically resolved. And that's all great, and we support, hopefully it's clear, we strongly support that kind of better data for what we'd call the location-based or grid average factors. We can do a lot better in helping companies estimate their scope 2 emissions based on their actual physical electricity consumption, using more resolved, meaning like more representative of the geography they're in and more representative of the time of use. And all that should happen, as quickly as practical. And even where that data doesn't exist, it would be great to develop, systems of kind of default, kind of model-based estimates for those grid average factors, which I think we can do because we generally understand what sorts of units are going to dispatch when in general in a lot of power markets. The question really comes here is there's also a lot of work going on to developing these separate, market-based certificate kind of hourly systems, that are not as, let's say, attached to what's actually physically happening on the grid. Obviously, they're attached to what's happening in terms of renewable energy generators, but not in terms of the broader grid across all generators. A lot of our comments are around not this physical grid averages, these location-based factors, but around certificate-based approaches, market-based approaches. And these are the issues that the GC Protocol Scope 2 Technical Working Group is addressing. And so they're moving forward on kind of both of these tacks, so kind of more kind of granular location-based and more granular market-based, and that's the direction of travel that they're in. And our comments support the first location-based, but are more, I guess, maybe I wouldn't say not negative against the all market-based, but critical of maybe some aspects of it. And then also there's a lot of work, which is going to be it's a whole nother complex discussion around how the integration of a new consequential kind of reporting metric. It's not really scope 2 anymore because it's around impact. It's not around inventories, but how that gets integrated into the broader GC protocol standard. Right now, scope 2 is sort of on a separate track. There's also a lot of questions about how such a consequential metric would play in terms of scopes 1 and 3. That has been kind of set, I guess, set on a longer time frame of how that gets addressed. But there, it's still very unclear how that's gonna play out. And we're happy to talk about that more as we get into further Q&A.
Awesome. Miranda, you're muted.
Sorry. While we're on this slide, Michael Leggett, we've got a lot of questions coming in around location-based, market-based, which currently the Greenhouse Gas Protocol governance structure is proposing that for market-based, at least a portion of that accounting for larger loads in certain regions would need to be matched hourly and to the geography of the load. And then this third optional of looking at consequential accounting. So there's some questions around, would this third consequential accounting be an either or? Could you choose consequential accounting instead of the load matched 24/7 accounting? Or are they both, is one optional? Are they all going to be required? What do we know and not know at this point in the process? There have also been some questions in the chat around the process itself and the relatively few market players, practitioners that are particularly on one level of the governance structure, the technical working group, although as you rise in the governance level, you do see more practitioner representation. And I'll just be really blunt because someone asked it, and it is something that I'm hearing. There's some concern that that there may be players in the governance structure that are looking to solve some of these data gaps and may actually be building commercial products. And so how does all that, we're putting it all out there apparently in the question and answer. I don't know how many people can see the question and answer, but there's a lot there. Tell us about where we are in the process, what these three things are, what does it mean for the average company, university, city, who's trying to follow the rules.
Yeah, lots of questions. I'm going to take that. So I think a lot of this. So I think that it is I don't know that it's an either or, and I don't know that they've quite figured out. So I think there is the inventory accounting, and the current recommendations are to maintain the location-based and the market-based. Those are both inventory accounting or allocational accounting, as Gillenwater has written about. I think that this new kind of consequential is they're trying to make space for consideration of that, what claims that will enable, how those interface, would I do the market and that or one or other? To me, some that's still a little bit fuzzy. And so one of the things we're going to talk about, what next, I'll tease this a little bit, is the best thing that we all can be doing is spending time understanding what's at stake so that we can engage in the public comments that are coming forward. So I'm going to race through really quick. One of the subjects we touched on, and I think the hot topic that we've seen and what we wrote about was kind of hourly matching. And briefly, is hourly matching the same as 24/7 CFE? No, it's not. They're different, but they're very related. So hourly matching is an accounting rule saying, what counts and what doesn't. 24/7 CFE is a target saying, I want to get 100% hourly matching. So these are different things. But just as the current rules don't require 100% annual matching, but that's what companies have sought to do, that will likely be the case again. And that is certainly a lot of the impact is companies reaching for a high level of hourly matching. That is where a lot of the impact comes from. So the draft 2 rule adopts the rule of hourly matching. It certainly does not mandate 24/7. I think the reality is that firms that are already boasting 100% renewable will feel pressure to try to reach for a high hourly score. So I don't think it's right to just dismiss, oh, reaching for a high level is hard. Like there are challenges there that I think will be real and relevant to these rules, even though they're not requiring it. So jumping past that, what is the promise of hourly matching? What are the pros? I don't want to just sit here and say like, oh, this is awful. There's nothing good about it. I don't think that's true. There are certainly benefits of hourly matching and of these 24/7 targets. It could improve the accuracy and of usage claims and the impact of climate action. Um, I think that it could improve the accuracy of usage. It's not perfect, but I think it could make things better by better alignment of kind of RECs purchased and consumed megawatt hours. I think it could improve impact by incentivizing, procurement that, incentivizes dispatchable generation. So kind of smoothing out that duck curve. It also could be pointed at other technologies, which isn't quite clear yet, hydroelectric, or even I've heard mention of like CCS, so carbon capture and storage equipped gas, which I'm a little suspicious of, but there's a conversation to be had there. I think it could improve impact by supplying, kind of hour and region matched certificates by limiting supply. So a lot of RECs today come out of fewer region or a subset of regions where wind and solar resources are good, where the markets are good, where land is, there's kind of it's easier to build renewables and more cost effective in certain regions. And so by limiting supply for companies that are in other regions to only be able to source from that region, they might push them to invest locally. But that also, I think, as we hinted at before, may be less compatible with these long-term forward contracts. I'm jumping ahead of a little bit. So I think the question is if we do that, but then shift out of long-term contracts into more spot purchases, we should be careful because just because because people are buying from a location and possibly at a higher price, it doesn't translate to kind of a bankable price signal for projects and make it easier to build projects. So I'm going to go ahead and jump to the next slide. I know we're running low on time, but Miranda and Gillenwater, I'll turn the mic back to y'all.
Yeah, I'll just jump in real quick. I mean, we made a lot of points in the paper. Hopefully, if you're here, you've read the paper. If not, please do, because we can't go into all that detail here, and we'll post the link again in the chat. But there, fundamentally, the underlying question here is, is a shift to this hourly market-based approach. One, is it going to do what we hope, or that the proponents hope it's going to do? I guess our argument is that it's a little unclear. Maybe we're jumping into something that might have some unintended consequences that could, potentially do, as much harm as good. We're not trying to trash it. We would love to make it better. My fundamental argument, and I think Michael Leggett agrees, is hopefully it's pretty clear here. We're talking about all these different. If you look at the kind of the direction of travel and the GT protocol proposal around this, there's all these kind of things about different thresholds for what would count in terms of hourly matching, who would have to do it, what how we deal with kind of scarcity rules in terms of constraints that are essentially proxies for additionality. All these other things, to me, that screams, hopefully it's patent, it screams like these are market design questions. These are like environmental market design questions. So what's really happening here again is we're setting up an environmental market. We're not doing inventory, like objective, policy neutral inventory accounting. And that's great. I would support a market mechanism around renewable energy claims. Let's optimize it to have as much impact as possible, so that companies can make credible, meaningful, claims of avoided emission impacts. That's all good. We can do that. But we shouldn't be laundering or hiding it within supposedly objective science-based inventory accounting rules. Let's put it out in the open, call it what it is, do it well, maximize the environmental impact, and again, give companies an incentive to do good things.
Absolutely.
So, Michael Leggett, can you walk us through, in just maybe a minute or so, the kind of recent events and the timeline, as well as where companies can get engaged in the process? And then hopefully we'll have a few minutes to cover a couple of the other questions that have come in the chat.
Absolutely. So really quickly, I think some of these recent events is really interesting. So first off, I'd like to commend the Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the working groups for publishing the presentations and meeting notes. We'll try to put a link to that, but I think they've been extraordinarily transparent. I just want to commend them for that. So from those published notes, in late May, the Independent Standards Board, the ISB, issued strong support for anchoring the market-based method eligibility around hourly matching and delivery. Over the following several weeks, multiple groups expressed great concern about that direction. SEBA, the Clean Energy Buyers Association, said imposing stricter kind of requirements is not very feasible for a lot of buyers, and it could curtail ambitious action. Other groups have followed and said similar things. Green Strategies did a survey where 80% of respondents lacked confidence they'd be able to kind of follow these requirements. Michael Gillenwater and I put out a paper trying to kind of speak to. So a lot of this, what you're seeing is concern about fewer options. I think because the standard is the foundation for target setting and so many other things, I think because the standard, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard, is a global standard and supports companies of different size and shape, and grids of different, size and shape. It's easy. It's hard. It's hard to kind of make one size that kind of fits everything. And I think that our concern is not 24/7 or hourly matching. Again, different but related. It's not to say that that's bad and has no place here. It's just to say as a requirement for all, I think is concerning. And even things where they're saying, well, maybe you don't have to do hourly, matching if you're this small in this region, speaks to the working group sharing that concern and trying to make carve outs for certain groups so they don't get hit. So fast forward a month after the ISP said they had strong support, the working group very recently in late June voted on multiple questions. And one of the questions was around, do you support kind of this hourly matching requirement? And I think it was 21 out of 22 said absolutely, without concern or change, fully support it. There was several people that said I support it, but I think there still needs to be some changes. And over a third said, no, I don't support it. Either I think there needs to be changes or I just don't support it at all. So it's contentious even inside the working group. Should we expect 100% support? Probably not. This stuff is complicated. But I think there's still more work to be done, which leads me to my last point, which is the ISB is reviewing the current draft now. We expect that to go out for public comment as soon as September. And so I think one of the most important things we can all do is try to understand the rules and what is being recommended, the various trade-offs and the complexities, so that we can weigh in and participate in the public comment period and try to make this as good as possible.
Okay, so last words from Michael Gillenwater. And again, thank you so much to the audience. We do have a lot of questions, and a lot of questions center around the different goals of voluntary procurement, whether it's driving for new renewable energy capacity, whether it's driving for load matched renewable energy that is matched to the load and the geography of your facilities and your use, and lots of questions around matching to the dirtiest grids. And does it make sense to actually have a bit more geographic flexibility to match to the grids that are actually the dirtiest? Then we have a lot of questions around data availability from your utilities. If you can't get the hourly data from your utilities or your meters, how does that work? If we're using estimates, which is what the current draft requests of us, is that actually driving to any further clarity or specificity in accounting? And then lots and lots and lots of questions around feasibility. how is this even going to be possible to do if I can't aggregate my load to do large utility scale offtake agreements? So we're going to do our best to give you all the best answers we can come up with in the most fair and balanced way we can. And Michael Gillenwater, why don't you take a minute to give your parting thoughts? And Michael Leggett, then you can give your parting thoughts and we will say farewell. And someone's already proposing a part 2 just for the Q&A, so we may offer that. Go ahead, Gillenwater.
Yeah, maybe we just do a pure Q&A discussion session there. I mean, we kind of knew this would happen. Anyway, I'll just try and do a flash round of answering questions. Clearly, what we care about here largely, let's just say, what really I would argue, and this is based on the research we've done, tried to dive deep into the, PPA impacts and actually do some empirical work. It's that de-risking of upfront project finance that really makes a difference. And that, the main mechanism that happens is through, oftentimes through PPAs that happen, again, before there's steel in the ground. That really makes a difference. But RECs, the kind of mental model there is that this is a subsidy to renewable energy generation. But clearly that subsidy makes a lot less difference. That subsidy effect makes a lot less difference to existing generation. And to be honest, it makes a lot less difference in general than the de-risking effect. I won't, for those that don't understand that, I won't get into, project finance, but and so again, inventory accounting rules don't make this kind of distinction between like risk transfer and subsidies and other things. That's a market design question. And so trying to, again, my broken record is like trying to do that trying to optimize that for impact within inventory accounting rules is going to be just a mess. Data availability is a real problem, and you see that in the proposed rules. There's like different, developing countries have different rules than other countries, and again, we're going to end up with this kind of kludgy thing where the claims being made by companies is going to get really complex, and different facilities are going to have different accounting rules that allow different market-based claims. So it's going to get really complicated fast, and we don't have any obvious answers to it other than like maybe this isn't the best thing to do again within an inventory accounting protocol. And I'll stop there.
Final words, Leggett.
I think we're all on the same team. The grid is still majority dirty. Companies have a role to play. Long-term contracts have been seen as, kind of a gold standard of a role they can play, but there's certainly other roles they can play, building on site, tax equity, and other things. And I think a lot of companies, just because they've achieved 100% annual matching doesn't mean that they're not trying to do better. They're not buying RECs every year and trying to do better. And we can make, methods that have been recommended for over a decade, the current protocol, SBTI, RE100, everybody recognizes and recommends these things. We can work to make those more accessible. I agree the greenhouse gas protocol is not meant to dictate procurement strategies and not meant to dictate targets. But the requirements are narrowing what options companies have, and I think for the worse as currently drafted. But again, I think honest conversations, we're all on the same team, and hopefully we'll get somewhere we're strong, where we can both be more accurate, have more impact, and have broad participation.
Well, thank you again, Michael, for sharing your extensive expertise with all of us. And thank you to all the folks that participated in the chat. I'm sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but we will gather them all up and get answers out and potentially do a follow-up Q&A. So hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon. Continue to do some reading, continue to talk to your colleagues, talk to your trade associations, to your experts, to your consultants, to your peers and other organizations so that you can really understand what's happening. It is going to matter. We know that these rules and reward systems do underpin how markets work. So get ready to get really engaged over the next few months. And thanks again to everyone. And thanks to Resurety for hosting this discussion today.
Thanks, everyone.